Okay. So, good afternoon. My name is Ricardo Rodrigues. I would like to welcome everyone to our first afternoon session. How can rural education and training systems address rural youth challenges? For those of you that did not have the chance to participate in the morning sessions, I would like to say that this first afternoon session is part of the conference Education, What's Next? Formal Education and Training and the Transition from School to Work in Rural Areas. The conference is organized by the EU-funded Cost Action Rural Needs Youth Network, which aims the creation of a European-led multidisciplinary network from countries showing higher need youth rates in rural areas. The network aims at developing a model of comprehension for rural needs, social exclusion risk, and protective factors based on a bioecological framework. Just one final note before we moving forward. So our 3 p.m. session, for those of you that would like to attend, we've changed the link for that session, and this link has been sent to all participants. So with no further ado, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome our esteemed guests and invited speakers, Professor Ingrid Schoen from University College London in the UK, and Professor Michael Corbett from Acadia University in Canada. This will be a 1-hour session, and Ingrid and Michael will have each about 20 minutes to present, meaning that we've foreseen room for discussion and questions from the audience at the end. You'll be able to ask your questions directly if you like, or in alternative, you can share them via our Zoom chat. So before giving the screen to Professor Michael Corbett, I would like first to say a few introductory words about his work. So Michael Corbett has worked as a professor in the School of Education at Acadia University since 2002. His research focuses on rural outmigration, youth educational decision-making, the politics of educational assessment, literacies in rural contexts, improvisation and the arts in education, the position of rural identities and experience in education, conceptions of space, place, and mobilities, and the viability of small rural schools. Michael Corbett has published widely, both in academic venues as well as for educational policy and practice audiences. Michael Corbett has worked with rural communities and schools in Australia and Canada, as well as doing international comparative work in Norway and Finland. Between 2015 and 2018, he served as professor of rural and regional education at the University of Tasmania, where he also holds an adjunct professorship. In 2020, he received a Career Achievement Award from the Rural Education Special Interest Group of the American Educational Research Association. Professor Michael Corbett, it's a great pleasure, as I mentioned before, to have you with us today. Thank you again, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's really a pleasure to be here. I suppose that introduction indicates a couple of things. One is that I'm primarily a qualitative researcher, but today I'm going to play in the numbers world a little bit as well, because the whole NEAT phenomenon to me is not only new, but a different way of framing something that I've looked at a fair bit in my career, in terms of looking at young people in rural areas who are socially excluded, who are racialized, who are members of various kinds of equity seeking categories. And the work that I'm going to draw on here over the next few minutes comes from mainly from a couple of people who work with Statistics Canada, who are high-level number crunchers for the Canadian government, effectively. And one is Sylvie Brunet, who's become the point person for NEAT analysis in Canada. And the other is Ray Bowman, who for the last 40 years has been the rural guru at Statistics Canada and has probably the best handle on the large-scale quantitative picture of what rural Canada looks like. Let's see if I can get this to change. There we are. So NEAT, the whole NEAT phenomenon is really a newly emerging phenomenon, I think, in Canadian educational research generally, and in terms of policy looks on the part of the national statistical body. And you can see here a number of recent studies, literally within the last 2 years, that have come out of different think tanks and university research organizations. And on the left-hand side of the frame, materials from Statistics Canada. The other thing that struck me as I was preparing for this research, reading the work of Francisco in your group, is the idea of agriculture as a growth area rather than an area of receding and marginal employment for young people. And this is something that I encountered very much in Tasmania, where there's a great concern for developing interest amongst young people in agriculture, but not agriculture in the sense of the way that it's been understood and perceived and stereotyped historically. So new forms of agricultural work are very much on the landscape there. And this is coming to Canada as well. And this is a 2019 report from the Royal Bank of Canada. And you know something actually matters in terms of policy direction when a major bank starts paying attention to it. So the agricultural issue is very much on the agenda. I want to make three kind of arguments, I guess, in this presentation. One is, and I think when we think about the rural, it's important to be thinking about what that actually means, how it's defined, how it's thought through. And in the Canadian context, we have a massive geography that contains incredible diversity. Rural space, in terms of physical geography, is something in excess of 98% of our land mass here in Canada. What rural actually means and how that translates from statistical definitions to actual life worlds is one issue. The second piece is, as I've mentioned, NEAT has not been a Canadian policy agenda issue, and rurality in NEAT is virtually non-existent in the Canadian context, as far as I can tell. And thirdly, I want to speak a bit to how the way that rurality is often framed as deficit without any particular need to dig any deeper into it. It's a kind of ideological notion. We call it metrocentric in my field of rural education, that simply when the word rural is spoken, it's lumped in other deficit categories. And I want to interrogate a little bit about what that might look like. Whoops, going the wrong way here. These things are go. Defining rural. Okay. First of all, I'm working in this piece, and I guess in my writing generally, with Henri Lefebvre's notion of social space that combines three elements. First of all, perceived space on the bottom right. The imagery in that particular piece is a place I very often go. It's called the Look Off in the Annapolis Valley of Nova Scotia, and it's a classic quintessential rural look, perceived space, which connects to a whole bunch of ideas about who's there and what happens in the place. So the immediate perceptual sense of space. On the top of the pyramid, though, space, according to Lefebvre, is also complicated by the way it's conceived and presented. And the image that I use is a map of Canada it's actually a neat statistical picture. So, and there are multiple conceptions of space. But space is also, I think, understood, and I try to understand it through the third corner of the diagram, which is as a lived phenomenon. And this picture was taken at some research that I was doing in small rural communities where those two people are fighting to keep a small rural school open when the school board has decided that community no longer needs a school. Goodness, I'm having trouble moving this thing. Ah, there we go. So perceived space. In the Canadian context, the geography is so diverse, and there are so many ways that space is used and conceptualized and seen. We have the Arctic tundra. We have vast kind of wheat fields in Western Canada on the prairie. We have in the bottom left-hand corner a major oil sands development, probably the dirtiest oil in Canada. In the world, that has just become an issue as Joe Biden has decided to shut down a pipeline project that was going to take oil from this area in northern Alberta to into the US. Questions of forestry and deforestation, of course, become significant. And the work that I've done in the center in kind of fishing communities in Atlantic Canada is part of the picture as well. So, as we conceive space, there are many ways that rural gets defined. And I guess the quintessential static definition of rural that's used by Statistics Canada is essentially communities of less than 1,000 with a population density of 400 per square kilometer. So using that static definition of what constitutes rurality, you can see across the country, we have Ontario where about 14% of the population live in a place defined as rural. Where I live in Nova Scotia on the Atlantic coast to the right, something like 2 in 5 people live in an area that's defined as rural. So that is a particular way of conceptualizing rurality. The notion of lived space illustrates, I think, the sense in which the world is moving. Things are continuously changing. And one of the most important, everybody in this picture lives in a rural community, but actually commutes and works in an urban area. So contemporary definitions now that are becoming more popular in Statistics Canada are less static and more interested in mobility. And the one that I'll be using a little bit in this presentation is the notion of the metropolitan influence zone. And what the metropolitan influence zone is a conception of rurality that takes into consideration the percentage of people living in that community who commute to a larger community. And basically, there are 3 essential definitions. One is a metropolitan area, a place of over 100,000. 71% of Canadians live in a place like that. Then we have the smaller urbanish areas that are called census agglomerations, CAs, communities of between 10,000 and 100,000. 12% of Canadians live in a place like this. And then we have rural and small town, where 17% of the population lives. And these rural and small towns are differentiated into 5 categories in terms of what percentage of the population commutes into a census agglomeration or into a metro area. Strong MIS, 6% of Canadians live in a place where more than 30% of the population commutes. Moderate MIS, 10 to 30%. Weak, or 5 to 30%, excuse me. Weak MIS, less than 5%, but more than 0. No MIS, nobody commutes. So virtually all communities in Canada, 99%, have somebody in them who commutes. Yeah, essentially 98, 99%. So how the Canadian geography looks in terms of these classifications, the places that have these white speckled, the white speckled area are large cities. We have a number of provinces, regions in the country that actually have no cities. That are considered metropolitan areas. The black are the small cities, and the rest of it is some form of rural area. So you can see there's vast diversity in terms of the different areas of Canada in the sense of who lives where. So the area that I work in and study, and you can sort of see the red in this picture is the only census metropolitan area. The dark brown are the large towns, places of over 10,000, and the rest of the place is some kind of rural area. What does it look like here? Youth unemployment, interestingly, is not hugely different between the city, where we have 12.9% youth unemployment as of 2019, the most recent data I could find. Outside the city's 13.7%. But what is really quite clear is that while the employment differential isn't so great, there is a fairly significant differential in terms of educational levels. And we're just about to have a new census in 2021, but the last census demonstrates that in urban areas, young people are much more likely to have not completed high school, that's no certificate, less than a grade 12 designation, as we call it, high school completion, which is the entry point into post-secondary education. And significant differences between urban and rural areas in terms of people who have university degrees. Youth unemployment in metropolitan, again, this is a closer look at what I sort of just presented. It's a complicated picture across Atlantic Canada. Nova Scotia is in yellow here, and my province is kind of hovering slightly above most of the time the national average, represented by the black line. In the urban or in the rural areas, it appears to be slightly higher. Something that's of course influencing the situation at this time is the effect of COVID, and you can see by these data that things have gotten much worse for rural youth, for youth unemployment in the country as a result of COVID, as it has for all age groups. So the whole phenomenon of the relationship between education, employment, and training has been inflected by recent events. So what do we know about NEET youth in Canada? Well, here's a quick and dirty, again, static definition from StatsCan. Nationally, we're looking at something around 11% who are defined as NEET. And the definition is the OECD standard definition. This is Statistics Canada material. And there's a fair bit of variability across the country. Out in the eastern part where I work, 15% in Nova Scotia, and in the other small eastern provinces of New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland, 15, 13, and 17 respectively. In the north, the NEET rates in Nunavut up at the top and in the Northwest Territory are extremely high. So there's, again, a very important distinction here that I'm going to get to in a second between rurality as it operates in southern Canada and rurality as it operates in northern Canada, and particularly in Indigenous communities. Essentially, what StatsCan are telling us is we've got three basic groups in the NEET category. 11%, about a third are caring for children, about a third are officially unemployed, which means they're actively seeking employment, and then about a third are in the other category. And what are they doing? Well, other analysis demonstrates that they're doing all sorts of things. And when Sylvie Brunet looks at the main activities of those who were classified as NEET over the past year, it ranges from going to school at some point, being unemployed at some point, caring for children, illness and disability, which is about 10% of the population, and some actively looking for work. So again, it's a very diverse group and difficult to kind of categorize in any simplistic way. And I think most of the analysis that's beginning to come out is sort of saying, you know, this is a category that really needs to be thought carefully about. And again, the COVID situation, if you look just from January 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdowns that begin occurring really in mid-March in Canada, the ramp up here is extremely significant nationally. So by April, the wine-colored graph on the right-hand side of each of these age groups more than doubles between January and April. So this population, the youth population, is very significantly impacted by COVID. Across the province, it's again, there isn't a huge amount of variability. Those provinces that have had more youth in out of employment, training, and education tend to see that essentially doubling. So the provincial effect isn't great. And again, this Queen's University report, which is about the only academic report I was able to find on NEET, situate rurality within their analysis as speculative. We speculate that people living in rural areas will have fewer opportunities because, and then they're dumped in with people with mental illnesses, various other kinds of marginality. So the assumption is that there will be a difference. But in the only really comprehensive look at StatsCan data, Sylvie Brunet actually finds no difference. So rural areas, youth in rural areas were more likely to be working and no longer in school, but they were no more likely to be present in as NEET, people defined as NEET in the Canadian data. So not significantly different, she claims. Using her very careful analysis of 20 to 24-year-olds. She's working on right now 19 to 29-year-old data to see if that holds up. And was telling me in a correspondence that it probably will. Moving on, understanding rurality in relation to social disadvantage. I think what the diversity of rural space in Canada sometimes, what's difficult to get at using both static and mobile definitions, quantitative definitions, is that there are rather profound differences between people congregated in those categories. So when we look at, we dig down into this data a little bit and take a look at particular demographics within the NEET population or within any population. What do we find? My qualitative work demonstrates that the relationship between education, employment, training, and engagement is enormously complex. The world of Atlantic Canada, which I study, is changing radically and has been over the last generation. So we have a number of nested problems, and perhaps we can get into some of them in the discussion. I'm not going to spend time here because there isn't much of it. So let's take a look at the percentage of it. Let's just take a look at who gets educated and who doesn't in terms of this metropolitan influence zone. So if you live in a city, you're much less likely to drop out of high school. And the rate of dropout increases as you move through the classifications till you get to the most isolated places, the RST territories, where the dropout rate is in excess of 50%. So let's look at what non-Aboriginal people, their data looks like. So if we take Indigenous people out of this sample and look at non-Indigenous people, non-Aboriginal people, take a look. The dropout rates are kind of on the Canadian average, which is about 10%. You know, I can talk to you a little bit about how that's all played out over the last 20 years. So 2001, you've got a dropout rate 15 to 20% in various areas. By 2016, the dropout rate is effectively flattened for non-Aboriginal people, regardless of where they are. And in fact, in the most isolated areas, the dropout rate is below, or it's comparable to the large city dropout rate, which is another interesting phenomenon. Let's take a look at Indigenous, Aboriginal populations in these areas. The dropout rate nationally, again, is about 10%. If you're Indigenous and you live in a large city, your dropout rate is double the national rate. As we go to the more rural end, the no metropolitan influence zone, the dropout rates are between 40 and 50%. Totally the opposite of those rates for non-Indigenous people. And there's a comparison. So what is rurality? What is educational disadvantage in rurality? White people living in rural areas are actually doing as well, if not better, than white people living in urban areas. Aboriginal people living in rural areas are doing very poorly in terms of educational achievement. It's a national embarrassment. And again, I don't want to use up too much more time. This is some more data. So I mean, the point of this is what's being done here. Finally, on the policy agenda of the Department of Education in Nova Scotia, there is a concern around the diversity, preparing teachers to speak to the differences, to work through and in sociocultural difference toward more equity provisions. I think I'll just, quick conclusions. Communities adjacent to metro areas, very similar. Generic findings about the similarity of rural and urban youth may not apply for historically disadvantaged social and cultural groups. And we have to take a look at who is rural. Rural itself is not an equity category. It contains diversity within it, and it contains levels of marginalization, I think, that are even more extreme than those found in urban areas. And COVID presents new challenges. And I think I'll leave it there if that's all right.
Thank you, Michael, for such a great presentation, really insightful.